All right. Making it through this unit quick. Let's just jump right in. So, last time we talked about Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium and kind of how we analyze and determine if something is evolving or not. And today we're kind of going to take mostly a look at how things evolve, like what mechanisms are actually responsible for things to become different species. So, this whole class revolves around something called the biological species concept. And this is essentially saying that we define species as any individuals that are able to produce viable, fertile offspring with other individuals. Well, any two individuals. So it's just a group of individual organisms that can breed with each other and produce viable, fertile offspring. Viable meaning they are able to compete and survive. Fertile meaning their kids are able to have kids themselves. So this topic will focus largely on speciation and how new species originate. We will also kind of highlight the ideas of macro and microevolution. Microevolution is focused on a population, whereas macroevolution is focused on like broad patterns, things like the development of a brain, or a central nervous system, a backbone, big things like that. So, the most important thing for new species to occur is reproductive isolation. There needs to be some barrier, something that stops the two species from producing viable, fertile offspring. The idea of hybrids will come up here. In these pictures, we see, I believe it's a liger and I don't know what to call a mule zebra. It's a donkey zebra. I don't really know. Something mixed with a zebra. These are some classic hybrids that do exist. Hybrids are just the offspring from two different species. Generally, they are infertile or non-viable. If they were fertile and viable, then the original parents must have been the same species, according to our definition. But usually they are not. If we have two different species, they have a hybrid that is viable and fertile, that would be considered a new species. But let's look at the two types. So the first type of reproductive barrier we are going to look at is the pre-zygotic barriers. So pre meaning before, zygotic meaning referencing a zygote, so a fertilized egg. So this is everything that can happen before fertilization occurs. These are things like stopping attempts to mate, something stops mating from succeeding, or if mating is successful, then fertilization itself doesn't happen. So let's talk about some of them specifically. The first is habitat isolation. I wish I had more images for these. Oh well. Habitat isolation is two species just living in completely different habitats. If they don't run into each other, they can't breed with each other. They need to actually be in the same physical location as each other. The second barrier or type of barrier is temporal isolation. Temporal meaning relating to time. And this is species breeding at different times of the year, usually. Humans don't think about this too much, but there are many animals that can only become pregnant at very specific times of the year, like dogs go into heat. Mammals generally go into heat. Salmon will only breed once in their lifetime. The idea is if you're not breeding at the same time, if you're not looking for mates at the same time, then you cannot actually mate and reproduce. So it'd be like looking for a Valentine's date in August. Not really gonna work. Behavioral isolation, I like to think of this as you just don't have any game. You don't know the courtship rituals, you don't know the other behaviors, you don't know the mating songs. You're just the awkward, you don't know how to talk to the opposite sex type of thing. So you don't know the mating dance, you don't know the mating song, whatever it is, you don't have the right behaviors. So all the things you're trying to mate with look at you, think you're weird, and do not mate with you. Finally, or second to lastly, we have mechanical isolation. Mechanical isolation is morphological differences, meaning the shape of things, and they prevent mating. That's what this image is here. It's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. Can't do it. The parts have to match up. I'll talk about an example with ducks in class. And then lastly, of the pre-zygotic barriers is gametic isolation. And this is just everything else happens. The sperm gets to the egg, but for whatever reason, the sperm cannot actually fertilize the egg. So fertilization does not occur. But everything else happens. So these are the barriers that happen before fertilization. You can kind of think of them. You have to be in the right place at the right time, with the right behavior, and the right parts in order to reproduce. Otherwise, nothing happens. Then we get to the post-zygotic barriers. I don't know why I have the peacock on this slide. It should be on the last slide, because this is a great example of a mating behavior that you need to know. But post-zygotic barriers are anything that prevent the hybrid zygote from developing into a viable, fertile offspring. The main ones are listed here, the first being just reduced hybrid viability. And this is, for whatever reason, the mix and match of genes just made the hybrid not develop well or correctly. So it may be fertilized but never actually become born. It may die before it is even born. It may die shortly after birth, but something just doesn't mix right. And the resulting hybrid is very weak, sickly, or doesn't develop correctly at all, and dies. Reduced hybrid fertility. Remember, for it to be a new species, that you need to produce viable and fertile offspring. So the first one took care of the viable part. The second one is the fertile part. Most often, hybrids are sterile. Donkeys and horses make mules, and they are all sterile. So they cannot reproduce with each other, but they are plenty viable and have plenty of use. And finally is hybrid breakdown. So hybrid breakdown is the first generation's all good. You get a hybrid, it works well, it's able to have kids. But as the generations go on, the hybrids start to become weaker and weaker or become sterile. So it's like everything worked out initially, but not more time goes by and we see actually, no, it didn't really work. Less common to be hybrid breakdown. The more common ones are usually just the hybrid is non-viable or non-fertile, or both are pretty common. So those are the barriers. How does speciation actually happen? We talked about reproductive isolation. So what we just went over are all of the barriers that can happen if you're living kind of in the same place. Those would all fall under sympatric speciation. Sim meaning same, like symmetric is symmetry. They're the same on both sides. So sympatric is same speciation. They're in the same location. They may be slightly different habitats in the same location, like one could live in the trees and one could live on the ground, but they're physically in the same space. And then allopatric speciation is some geographic barrier. This is kind of the easiest one to understand. This is like the Galapagos finch example, basically any islands example. They show a mountain range here, but allopatric speciation is you just geographically separate two populations. It could be just a canyon, a river, even if your population can't swim, man-made things, all of that. Something just physically separates two populations so they no longer interact with each other, and then accumulate differences, new species, etc. Allopatric is kind of your classical Darwinian model of speciation, whereas sympatric is more modern in understanding. But both are correct. Allopatric just is a bit easier to understand. So how does speciation actually occur in allopatric speciation? Mutations over time, natural selection, the environments will be slightly different, and so you may select for different traits. You may have different predators in each environment, so you may have to look different. And then finally, just genetic drift. So the random changing of allele frequencies over time due to random chance, not due to natural selection. But ultimately, some barrier comes in, splits the population, they accumulate genetic differences, and eventually will be two different species. But it's important to remember with these that a geographic barrier for something may not be a barrier for another. So the example is a canyon is a good barrier for rodents. They can't really get up to the other side of the canyon, but birds could just fly over. So sometimes a barrier is only a barrier for specific species and not others. Sympatric speciation is, again, within a population. It can result from a number of things, but one of the main ones is polyploidy. This is getting extra sets of chromosomes, or a gene duplication event as well. But essentially having some major genetic change event that does provide an advantage so you continue to survive. This is way more common in plants than it is in animals. Strawberries, for example, have like 7 copies of every gene because they've gone through so many duplication events. But animals generally suffer if this happens, but it can happen. It could just happen from new ecological niches showing up. So let's say humans come into the area, landscape change things. A forest fire comes in and removes most of the tall trees. This would open up new niches that the organisms need to then fill. And then lastly, sexual selection can drive speciation as well. If the organisms have some sort of sexual preference, that will eventually lead to a split and division of speciation too. So sympatric speciation, probably a bit less common, less easy to observe, because everything is in the same place. So it's more behavioral and more finding new niches. You kind of need some outside factors to have a role, either the random chance of mutation, some new sexual selection preference, or a new ecological niche. Okay. So there are 2 main theories as to how the rate of speciation really occurs. And that is punctuated equilibria or a gradual pattern. Gradualism is what it's called. As we get more and more evidence, it is becoming more and more clear that there is a ton of punctuated equilibria events where you have things that basically don't change for a long period of time. They're in stasis, they're frozen in time, no real changes, and then suddenly something happens and you get a very quick speciation event, a very quick change that we can see in the fossil record. So in the fossils, species will suddenly show up, exist for a while, not really changing, and then completely disappear. That is the theory of punctuated equilibria, where it's kind of little rapid chunks of change rather than this slow, continuous pattern that gradualism predicts. Now, this isn't to say that gradualism doesn't exist at all. It certainly does. It's just that punctuated equilibria, major events, can cause evolution to happen faster than we usually think of it. It can be pretty rapid. It can happen in a couple generations, or it could be over the course of hundreds of generations. It kind of just depends on how strong is your selective pressure. And that is it for this lecture. We will work on this in class. We have, I think, 2 more to go. That's all. Wish me luck at robotics. If I come in Monday and I'm sad, it's because we didn't do well. Bye.